Welcome, everybody. If you are here for person-centered cultural humility, you are in the right place. Gonna pass it over. Hey, everybody. Gonna pass it over to Kate. Is there anything you wanted to add before we started? Nope. Okay.
None whatsoever. Friendly reminder to use the chat box. We are going to go into breakout rooms, so keep an eye on the screen for when that moment happens. And also feel free to mute and unmute yourself as the presentation allows. Have fun, everybody.
Awesome, awesome. Gonna pass it over to the presenters, the lovely Tanya Richmond and the lovely Danietta Najoli. Take over, ladies.
Danietta, start us off.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad that you're here today as part of the gathering sessions. We are going to be sharing a lot of information with you within a short period of time, but we wanted to introduce ourselves first, and I'm going to start by introducing myself. So my name is Danietta Najoli, and a little bit about me is that I've worked with people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities since 2000 for over 22 years in a variety of different roles. I currently work for a small person-centered nonprofit organization where I help people with intellectual and developmental disabilities make authentic social connections outside of the service system. And these social connections are based on their shared interests and hobbies and strengths and passions and even their neighborhoods. And so I hold a certificate of advanced proficiency from the Ohio Alliance for Direct Support Professionals. And this past December, I completed Cornell University's Diversity and Inclusion Program certificate. I'm originally from Harlem, New York City, and I currently live in Cincinnati, and I've operated my own growth, mindset, and personal foundations practice for over 22 years, where I provide learning experiences and training around a variety of soft skills topics like the one we're going to get into today. So I'd like to introduce you to Tanya. She's going to introduce herself.
Hi. I'm Tanya Richmond. I think I've been introduced a few times at the gathering, but I'm a co-chair of the learning community for person-centered practices. I am with Support Development Associates as a partner. I've been a social worker for over 30 years, and that's probably all you need to know at that point. I will say Danietta and I met, it was somewhere in the middle of the pandemic to do this type of training for an initiative in New York. And you know how you meet some people sometimes that you just think, oh, I've known this person all my life. That was my experience with Danietta. So we've enjoyed doing this. We have lots of plans, which we'll tell you a little bit about as we go through this, but I'm going to go ahead and start us off and just let you know that we're hoping that our only goal for this is really about just helping you have an introduction to person-centered cultural humility. This is not a deep dive. If you came for that, we're going to keep it at a surface level, but we hope that it's going to expand your knowledge and also you'll feel more confident about really understanding what person-centered cultural humility is. The world is really, really big, as you know, and culture, when we talk about it for the training that we typically do, when we're talking about culture, what we mean are the characteristics and the knowledge of a particular group of people. And it might include things like their language, their race, their foods, could be social habits, music, arts, many, many more things. And obviously we can't cover that in 45 minutes. Culture is a huge topic because the world is a big place. And so it's really difficult in a small time frame to be able to touch on all the things we might. But what we are going to focus on today is cultural humility from a person-centered perspective, because it's a really good starting point that needs to be present in everything we do as we address and look at culture. Learning about the individual person has been a real core belief of the learning community since its inception. And we believe that we need to learn about the person and how they see themselves and what their perspective is about balance in their life. If we add a cultural lens to that, we can think about how the person sees themselves in their cultural circumstances, in their stage of development and the place where they are right now. So I'll very briefly touch at the end of this presentation back to your person-centered skills that are helpful in exploring culture with someone, and who, particularly if they're receiving supports and services, but you could use them in any context. and also helping people describe cultural connections and beliefs or their worldviews. The great news is this isn't new person-centered skills. It's the same skills you already that you already have. You already know how to use them. It's just using them with an eye towards culture and an ear towards culture. And we also mean that culture is an agreed upon way of doing things that are recognized by a group of people. So it might be a social group, it could be a nation, a family, a work team, it could be our learning community. We have our own culture here, but usually we're referring to a group of people. We could also be referring to an individual person. Cultural competence, we're going to touch back to a couple of things that you've probably received training on. Cultural competence is really about understanding who you are and who others are, and continuing to learn and reflect on our own practices. So if you look kind of at what's here on the screen, if we're the first block there, this is really about effectively interacting and understanding and communicating with people across cultures and being open-minded and respectful of cultural differences in people that we meet. But we also have to be aware of our own worldview and how it developed. Danietta and I have plans to really dig deeper into that topic with folks, because I think it's so important. And but that can really help us understand how our cultural beliefs came to be, and that shapes our behavior patterns, our thoughts, our manners, our actions. And that happens often because it gets passed down to us through generations. So that may negatively impact us, it may positively impact us. And so as we think about communication, trust, relationships, all the stuff we spend all of our time in the learning community talking about, this becomes a really important concept because it can have an impact when we're providing services and supports to someone. We also want to make sure we're developing positive attitudes toward cultural differences and seeing diversity as a gift and as a strength. And as we're learning about cultural practices, both the similarities and the differences, and gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews. Sometimes what contributes to barriers in a person's life might have to do with stigma. So stigma about being from a different culture. It could be stigma, we're very familiar with stigma from having a mental illness. That's been one that we've worked with in our field for a very long time. But it could also be that people maybe have limited language or limited literacy or differing abilities, or they're unfamiliar with services, or they just haven't experienced services. It might be because of oppression. It could be because of racism, discrimination, trauma, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to make sure that we are making a personal commitment in the learning community as we do our work, so that we can really learn as much as we can about people from different cultural groups and turn that knowledge into the skills we need to be able to do our work. Because to do good support with people and to help people have that meaningful life that they define for themselves, it's necessary for us to be more culturally competent. And my guess is if you've received training on culture, it's probably been around the area of cultural competence.
One thing too is, a couple of examples of cultural competence might be when a person wears a particular piece of jewelry or clothing. Like, in my case, I'm wearing jewelry that is culturally significant to me, although you may not be able to see it because of the background screen. But basically being able to be respectful when talking with the person and inquiring about that. If you are curious, and we'll talk about how that can happen. And then also being more aware of our own culture and our worldview, so that how we see things shows up, and being willing to learn more about the person and what their culture means to them. So now we're going to look at a couple of things here when it comes to cultural competence, because there are certainly a few limitations that we need to bring out, and we are going to touch on what culture and humility is in relation to that, and ask ourselves, can both be applied? Can cultural competence and cultural humility be applied? So I'm going to take you back to the late 90s for this. In the late 90s, there were two medical doctors who thought very deeply about the major limits that the use of cultural competence was having, particularly on people in poor or underserved communities. And they saw a need for more cultural sensitivity, which included an understanding of the built-in power imbalances or the differences in power that exists within a leader-member relationship. So in their case, it's a doctor-patient relationship. The two doctors began to realize over time that if they were regularly mindful and actively checking themselves when they talked with their patients, that they were using something called cultural humility. This is very different from cultural competence, where we learned in the previous time here. Because as we said, cultural competence is really a journey that doesn't end, but the word competence might make someone think that you can become culturally competent through a single learning experience, such as taking this breakout session, being a part of this session. It's almost like if I say, okay, I'm going to eat one stalk of broccoli and I am forever healthy. I never have to touch another vegetable a day in my life again. Of course, show of hands, who would love that to be the case? Of course, right? But we know that it takes practice. We know that it takes something that is not just one and done. So let's look at cultural competence as it relates to some of the limitations that are involved. Some of the limitations that are included within cultural competence is that it's more focused on learning new knowledge, getting really good at speaking and communicating with those who are different from us. Basically, it's like checking a box that we've learned about cultural competence. This includes learning about the other person's culture, but without having to think about our own culture or our own background. And another limitation is that in the many ways that cultural competence has been tested, being white or Caucasian was understood and said to be the standard of what is normal as compared to others who are different from that standard. And we'll definitely cover a little bit more about this later when we look at, different definitions like implicit bias that we all have and that we all need to be aware of. Another limitation is that cultural competence does not include the presence of social justice issues that can greatly impact the power differences or the imbalances that exist, such as in a provider and client relationship that many of us are a part of and we're familiar with. And another limitation is that a limited understanding of only race or only ethnicity or religion as being part of culture. And that leaves out the many other aspects of culture that we described earlier. Tanya mentioned how, culture is about language or foods or social habits, even music, arts, and not to mention the very people that make up culture, such a rich, vast array. And another limitation is that cultural competence has a tendency to stereotype. There's a potential to stereotype cultural groups. And these are groups that are made up of individuals who are naturally different from each other in important ways. So cultural humility fits very nicely with and can be considered a key aspect of a person-centered approach. In fact, we have called this session Person-Centered Cultural Humility for that reason. Okay, because cultural humility is a lifelong practice of focusing on learning about ourselves and challenging our own beliefs. We also look at self-reflection and personal critique, and these are all part of cultural humility. It also addresses the power imbalances that are baked into the leader-member relationship, like a doctor-patient or a provider-client relationship or provider-person receiving supports or services relationship. Basically, cultural humility turns the expert into a learner and the person being served and supported into an expert of themselves. And each time that we speak with someone, the encounter can be new and fresh, and it requires an attitude of openness and a sense of egolessness. It involves supportive interaction focused on always learning about the other person and actually learning from our differences. So there's a fair amount of interpersonal skills here at work, and the understanding that our differences have something to teach us about ourselves. So the question becomes, can both be useful? Can cultural competence and cultural humility be useful? We think they can be useful because there are benefits, so many benefits to using cultural humility within a person-centered approach. Cultural competence can and should still be used to help you with your lifelong practice of using cultural humility, especially as Tanya described it, through a person-centered lens. So we won't toss out cultural competence completely, but we do need to recognize its limitations in order for it to be useful.
You've also probably been introduced to cultural proficiency through training. And I'm not going to touch on this super deeply because we really want you to have an opportunity to go into a breakout room with one another. But in general, to provide person-centered support, we often would become more aware of ourselves and then also start to develop those right attitudes about how we can practice from a cultural standpoint. So we might learn about our own culture, we might check out our assumptions, we might not assume we understand someone based on the fact that we know they're from a certain culture or based on how they look. So we're always trying to learn more about others as individuals and really being open to others and learning doing our research and applying what we learn. Cultural proficiency, if we think about what it means to be proficient, it means to be good enough to teach something, or it means to be good at something. So we tend to teach people in classes around culture, we teach cultural competence, we teach cultural proficiency. And proficiency is helpful because it can really help us understand what culture is and how important it is in a person's life. When we're doing our person-centered discovery, we might understand what sits at the core of that person and, on their heart, and how that relates to their culture or them in their cultural context. We want to make sure that we are continuing to understand and honor the differences and the similarities within and between culture, and really think about diversity as being a benefit. And we want to make sure that as we are interacting among and across cultural groups, which we often will talk about, and we may pass through many of those in a day's time, that we're doing that in a way that's respectful and knowledgeable, and that we are really honoring our desire to be respectful. Building an appreciation of cultures into our work and also into our organizations, really making sure that we are thinking about the culture of our agency if we're working in an agency, and how we honor the various cultures of the people who work there and also the people who use our services and supports, and that our policies and our laws all line up with that. And how are we adapting our organizations or our group or ourselves to people, rather than asking people to adapt to the culture of our organization. Oh, sorry, I animated a slide. This is my kryptonite. Anybody who knows me knows that if I put animation on a slide, I'm going to blow past it every time. There we go.
I was wondering where that went, the animation. Okay, so let's talk about cultural humility here. It's front and center. This is the definition that we're working with. Cultural humility is definitely a lifelong commitment to self-reflection and personal critique, to addressing the power imbalances that are oftentimes built into the leader-member relationship, which can include many of the relationships that we find ourselves in or have witnessed, such as a doctor-patient relationship, a provider-person receiving supports and services relationship. And cultural humility is hinged upon the lifelong use of self-reflection and self-critique, but for the purposes of developing mutually beneficial partnerships and communities and people, and sometimes on behalf of people. So we're, excuse me, we are always growing and learning about ourselves in meaningful ways. And there's also a fair amount of institutional accountability where organizations can assist in making it easier for cultural humility to become a core value in the workplace and within institutions. So, it's not always easy to evaluate or critique ourselves or our own teams or organizations. So this will definitely take practice, like we talked about earlier, with the muscle building, and maybe even enlisting help from others whose feedback we trust. And we gently become more self-aware. I think, for one, if we can become more self-aware, that's really a first step to developing cultural humility and self-awareness. That's kind of like low-hanging fruit in my mind. And the other thing is, you all are doing some significant work to support people every day, whether in their homes or on their jobs or in their communities. And if you're like me, you're probably encountering a few challenges at times around understanding and getting to know the person so that you can ultimately support them better. And I have found that when I have a level of awareness of who the person is, which could adapt or adjust depending upon their environment and the people in it, I can be a much better support. And who the person is has a lot to do with the person's culture. That's the way that the person does things, whether individually or an agreed upon way of doing things within their group that they belong to, like a family or social group. And I've also found that developing a strong sense of cultural humility will take me so much farther in successfully supporting people. Just one story, part of my culture is to give honor to my elders and to those who have come before to pave the way. And part of my culture is also to show gratitude, which it might be a part of other people's culture too. It's also safe to say that giving honor and thanks sometimes through special ceremonies and recognitions is a part of my African cultural group, where we almost always honor our ancestors and those who have paved the way. So that's an example of our personal culture. But let's kind of go to the next slide. This is an exciting slide. Thank you, Tanya, for for developing this. This is beautiful. The Magnolia speaks. So this Venn diagram shows a way to consider culture when supporting and serving others. It's just one way. And now cultural competence, as you can see, is knowing that something needs to be done to appreciate someone else's culture. And also it's also about knowing why it's important. So it's the what to and the why to. And cultural proficiency is skillfully interacting with others who are different from us. So this is about the act of doing it really well. And I'm sure we can think of someone we know who seems to interact very well with people from all walks of life, seemingly all ethnic perspectives, racial, religious, political backgrounds, for example. My grandfather used to say, people are people, when I was growing up. And this motto really plays out in being culturally proficient, because if people are like you and me as part of the human race, then there's scientific proof that actually says we are more alike than we are different. And we can use our differences to add value to one another and to our own communities. And this kind of lays the groundwork to making us better able to skillfully interact with others. So another way to look at this is that if cultural competence and cultural proficiency is what we know about a person and what to do when interacting with the person, then cultural humility is what we don't yet know about a person. And it's also where the person has all the expertise. And having cultural humility means that we desire to want to know those things that we don't yet know about a person. So it's really about being and staying curious in a respectful, natural, and authentic way. And I'm very grateful that cultural humility can develop as the relationship grows and strengthens, because this means that we can all benefit from having many touches and chances to practice. So, and for all of us who have a love of learning, cultural humility can really make our time spent working with others come alive. And it's when all these three are actually combined, the competence, the proficiency, and the humility, when they're all working together while we're supporting another person, that we are simply making a good habit and a solid habit of using person-centered cultural humility.
And so just to clarify, Danietta came up with this Venn diagram, a model that kind of blends all of these concepts together. I came up with the flowers because she wanted some art on it. And I think it's like the first time we've done this together. And I'm very excited to see where this model takes us. So I think it's brilliantly stated. We are also going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about a culture of one, and you may be familiar with some of this from some of our person-centered work, but it's really to encourage us to get to know people as whole people, not making assumptions or assigning labels, and that's on track with what we do in the learning community anyway, but we also don't assign labels based on culture, race, ethnicity, or identity. And a person-centered approach to culture is really about learning about people at that one-to-one level, that individual level, where we're discovering from the person's perspective, what do they believe and what are their values and what are their preferences as it is in the context of their culture. As we do avoid using labels for people and putting people in certain categories, we can recognize that when we put a cultural label on someone, we may be actually neglecting to look at their individual identity, and we might be limiting them in some way. So we think of having every person as having a culture of one. And everyone has their own history, beliefs, values, experiences, preferences within the cultural groups that they belong to. And knowing those individual differences is really essential in helping best support a person. We also need to understand a person's identity in the context of their culture. So sometimes people, as they see themselves in the relationship to their culture, that may also be an important focus for us to help us understand how do they see themselves in their context. Are they like, are they different? I will tell you, I see myself as a Cajun woman. When I go home, I am not a very Cajun woman because I've not been there since I was in my 20s. And so I've really kind of come away from some of those Cajun things that make me culturally Cajun, but I certainly feel Cajun, and in North Carolina, I'm very Cajun. So it really does matter the context. And that's another thing that we might find ourselves paying attention to. So a culture of one, I think, is a nice concept in our person-centered practices, to dig deep, to discover the beliefs that people have, their preferences for every person. And it starts with all those good conversations that you're already having using your person-centered skills, and some openness and some curiosity. And as Danietta said, some egolessness, really being willing to be open-minded and be a blank slate when we approach these conversations. And then very briefly, thinking about our values and what they do in our lives. And I won't go into much depth here because, again, we want to get you into breakout rooms, but core values help define who you are as a person. And probably their most important function is to guide your daily decision-making, guide your daily behavior. And they come from a variety of places. Our earliest caregivers, whether those were parents or we were cared for by someone else, are often the most influential people in our lives. And there's a lot of research that actually says values are built in. So in babies, newborn babies, that they're actually values, which is surprising to me, but there's a lot of evidence that says that's true. But certainly by the time we're 3 to 5 years old, a lot of those are pretty hardwired in us. We have our values, or our core set of values, set for ourselves. And then over the course of our life, those get impacted by other adults who are significant to us, other people, our friend group when we're teenagers, events that happen. I always say I probably would not have been a social worker if there had not been a big hurricane in the town where I lived when I was a very young child that destroyed our town. And I saw the compassionate examples of other people and people being present with one another in this time of great need and pain. And I just found it the most, interesting thing ever. And it's always stuck with me. And I still remember it very vividly. And I think that's where compassion as a value came from in me. So they get shaped over the course of our life. And it's important for us to understand what our values are and how they impact us as we interact with others to provide services and supports.
And so now we're actually getting ready to go into our breakout session for today. We'll take about 10 minutes to do this, give or take, but we'd like for you to participate in a small group conversation. We'd like for you to share some of your personal reflections on when you used cultural humility to provide a service or support to someone. Remember, cultural humility is really about our own approach to using self-reflection, self-critique, and understanding the power imbalances that are within a leader-member relationship to build mutually beneficial partnerships on behalf of people and with people. And what are some of the things that you noticed about yourself when supporting a person? How did you convey dignity and respect to the person based on their culture or the person's culture of one? Try to be as specific as you can. And if you cannot think of a time when you personally use cultural humility, share time when you've seen it in action. Okay, so let's take about 10 minutes and each person will have about 3 minutes or so to share in your group, and then we'll bring you back into the large group after that. Share.
And so Danietta, I'm going to put him in for 8 minutes so we have enough time to round out our presentation since we can't be late. So opening the room now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for sharing, a time when you used cultural humility. Let's see, I'm just going to say, you can put in the chat if you would, what was some of the things that you learned or that you shared. And that would help us with the, as we move through. And maybe we have, look, I'm tempted. Maybe we have time for one person to share, briefly by unmuting yourself. Like, what's one thing that that you have done around cultural humility?
Hi, this is Danley from Centene. I was in a breakout session with Ed Lawson. And so we kind of just overall talked about our interactions in general and how we approach it with transparency, in that, we don't know. And the folks have been receptive to being able to explain because they recognize that we're being genuine and sincere with our lack of knowledge on certain things. So we kind of talked about that. And then, self-reflection and, recognizing like our own biases that we may bring to interaction. So we kind of talked about overall our previous work and current work.
Thank you so much, Stanley, for sharing that. Yes, that's something specific, looking at your own implicit bias, which we all have, and then also, listening to others. I mean, these are all things, and I see some in the chat that talk about respectful curiosity, right? And reciprocity and learning, right? Sometimes being vulnerable and sharing some things about yourself in order to kind of level that baked in leader-member relationship that's inherently involved in serving someone. So yeah, that we always get a ton of types of reactions from this. And thanks for sharing, keep sharing those. We had down my recipe, as you can see in that PowerPoint slide. So what we would love for you to do is if you can share something that you know how to do, especially a cook dish, a recipe that you know how to cook or bake, that would be great. We have it in the landing page, this particular recipe card, because we want to start hearing from you, hearing the different cultural recipes that you have. Tanya and I have been talking about doing a cookbook for the last year and a half when we started doing this training, and because mostly everyone will say that they know how to do a specific recipe that they've learned in traditional learning. So we thought this would be great to hear from you, and we will definitely link you if you share that with us. It's a project that we have out there and ongoing. So it'll be in the landing page. And so now we can kind of look at a couple of other things, especially around like just never stop learning, right?
Yes.
And then before we do that, Tanya's going to share a little bit about person-centered
So
practice.
I'll only say this briefly because these guys are ringers with person-centered practices. You can use your same person-centered skills to support cultural humility, because those same skills help you have conversations that really understand from the person's perspective what represents balance, whether it's about culture or not, but embraces the diversity and really supports the person to be included and looks at the person from a whole person perspective. So there is no one right way to do that, and there is no one size fits all. So it's truly about supporting the individual person. So we will kind of end with this, and Danietta will kick us off.
Yes. So definitely never stop learning. As it was already mentioned, I think Danley mentioned, always learning about other people and putting yourself in that position of the posture of curiosity, respectful guessing, and things of that nature, because it's so important, also to unlearn information that we once thought we knew about a person that may no longer be true, right? We all know the whole notion of misinformation that's out there in the world. So we want to apply that to the person that we're supporting, and then identify and work through our own biases, our own maybe the stereotypes and the mindsets that we may have, because we're in the air, it's in the air, it's in the water, it's baked in. So we have to address it that way.
We also want to make sure we move out of our comfort zones. They're comfortable for a reason, but that's not where the growth happens. And really make sure that we're allowing for mistakes when we are learning, understanding that we will make mistakes, but we always want to use that to learn more, to fail forward, to make sure that we are applying that to do our work better. And then finally, we want to ask you to sign anything, but we do have some commitments we would love for you to ascribe to, and those are on the landing page. Do you want to say more about that, Danietta?
No, it's just something that we've developed over time when we've been working together, Tanya and I, for the last year and a half. We came up with a few, which one of them includes appreciating and welcoming and enjoying our own cultural diversity and being aware, right? That's like the low-hanging fruit we talked about. So we came up with about 10 of them, and it's also on the landing page.
Thank you so much, everyone. Do send a recipe if you feel like it. Danietta and I will put your recipe in the book and attribute it to you. We absolutely think this project is going to be great. And come see us if we're training any other time on this. We have big plans about additional trainings we'd like to do just to go deeper into this topic. But we thank you so much for being here today. And we did mention the survey, right? It's on the...
Yeah, we didn't mention it, but it is on the landing page. So please feel free. It's a very short survey, 2 to 3 minutes tops. We'd love to hear from you to start collecting data around like what people's temperature is around cultural humility and receptivity. So thanks for sharing and being a part of this presentation.
There's a quick question in the box. Amy Day is a visual learner and wanted to know, are there any good videos regarding cultural humility? And if you can't answer now, maybe we can email Amy later, one way or the other, reach out to her.
Okay, I don't know of any, but
Okay. If
I
you
don't
okay.
either. I'll have
Okay.
to research that.
but if I
and
run
send it.
across them, Amy, I promise we'll send your way.
Awesome. Thank you all.